Before we drift into the sands of time, my dear nighttime historians, don't forget to leave a sleepy little comment below. Perhaps your favorite ancient remedy or odd bedtime beverage. And of course, gently tap the subscribe button and ring that little bell so you'll be the first to know when we uncover more historical bedtime curiosities. Now, let's begin. Slowly, like the Nile at dusk. It was sometime around 620 BCE near the banks of a sleepy stretch of the Nile when a curious rumor began to ripple through the villages like a mild breeze rustling papyrus reeds. People were murmuring, not panicking, of course, because that would involve far too much energy, but gently concerned in that ancient Egyptian way where even worry was conducted with elegance. Apparently, a gentle fever had made its way downriver. Nothing dramatic, mind you, just a touch of warmth in the cheeks, a bit of restlessness at night, and the sort of delirious poetry one might accidentally mutter while attempting to harvest dates in the afternoon sun. The priests at the Temple of Thoth had no definitive scrolls about it. The cats were uninterested. So the villagers did what people in ancient Egypt often did when faced with uncertainty. They visited someone who smelled faintly of incense and claimed to know what the gods were thinking. In this case, that someone was a woman named Meritaten. Now, Meritaten wasn't what you'd call official. She didn't wear golden collars or chant in full priestly meter, but she had a way with herbs, a steady hand, and most importantly, a cobra. Or rather, a former cobra. All that remained of the creature was its curved fang, sealed in a carved ivory tube, and stored on the highest shelf of her mud brick clinic, right between a jar of myrrh and a bundle of peppermint leaves tied with reed string. This fang was her treasure, not because it was particularly valuable, but because it gave her a reputation. People whispered with the kind of wide-eyed reverence usually reserved for bakers who never burn their bread that she had discovered how to tame Cobra Venom and turn it into medicine. Now you might be asking, was that true? That's the fun part. You see, in ancient Egyptian healing traditions, snakes, particularly the cobra or uraeus, were creatures of both danger and divine protection. The great goddess Wadjet, often depicted as a rearing cobra, was believed to spit fire at the enemies of the pharaoh. So naturally, it wasn't much of a leap to believe her venom in the hands of someone properly respectful and mildly eccentric could do some good, especially if mixed with a generous portion of honey and optimism. So one afternoon, under a shady awning woven from palm fronds, a tall, slightly sweaty man named Rennie came to see Meritaten. He wore a worried look and a tunic that had seen better decades. With the dramatic flair of a court actor, he declared the fever. Meritaten, never one to rush, gave him a thoughtful nod and handed him a cup of cool water, not the venom yet. Hospitality first. She asked him what he felt. He described a curious warmth, the inability to sleep well, and somewhat sheepishly that he'd been talking to a goat the night before. The goat had not responded. After a moment of pondering and a ritual sniff of dried mint, she brought down the ivory tube. With great care, she used a reed needle to extract just the tiniest residue from the preserved fang. Then in front of Rennie, she stirred it into a small bowl of honey-thickened beer, added a few flakes of dried tamarind, and handed it to him with a smile that said, "If this doesn't help, it will at least taste interesting." Rennie took a breath, offered a small prayer to Wadjet, and drank. Now to be clear, cobra venom, especially when dried and diluted, can have medicinal properties. Modern scientists have explored its enzymes and peptides for pain relief and anti-inflammatory use. But Meritaten, of course, didn't have a lab. What she had was intuition, patience, and a sharp memory of stories told by her grandmother, who swore that a properly respectful venom sip could wake the body like a sunrise without the shouting. The result: Rennie returned the next day brighter-eyed and convinced the goat had forgiven him. Word spread faster than a hippo in a shallow pond. Soon, villagers were lining up for Meritaten's sacred drop, a daily ritual always taken under shade with a bit of bread and a moment of silence. She never gave it to children or to anyone in a real rush. Cobra Venom, she'd say with a wink, doesn't like to be hurried. As demand grew, so too did her reputation. Merchants from Memphis stopped by, scribes wrote notes in the margins of temple papyri, and one overly enthusiastic potter began selling tiny clay cups labeled Sekhmet's shot. That part annoyed Meritaten slightly, mostly because the cups were too small for proper sipping. Still, she remained calm, like the Nile, always flowing, always mysterious, always full of secrets just waiting to be stirred with honey and a drop of something daring. And so began one of ancient Egypt's quietest medical curiosities, the tale of how Cobra Venom, handled with care and just a dash of ceremony, became the talk of the riverbanks. Now take a breath. Imagine the slow current of the Nile outside your window. Picture a quiet healer humming as she stirs a honeyed brew under the moonlight, and let that thought guide you gently toward the shores of sleep. Let us now drift like a lazy felucca down the Nile into the next chapter of our tale. Now you might assume that a woman giving out diluted cobra venom in a clay teacup might attract a little official attention. And you'd be right. Though not from the pharaoh, who was far too busy discussing pyramid symmetry, or from the royal court physicians who mostly debated whether dried pigeon feathers cured joint aches. No, the ones who came knocking on Meritaten's reed-framed door were the scribes. Ah yes, the scribes, the real bureaucratic force behind ancient Egypt. They were the note-takers, the margin doodlers, and the champions of documenting everything from royal births to grain rations to the curious case of Rennie and the fever-talking goat. Scribe Mena was the first to arrive. A tall man with a slightly stooped posture from too many years hunched over papyrus. He carried three things: a scroll, a small ink pot, and an expression of permanent polite suspicion. He introduced himself as the recorder of unverified rural remedies, which he said with all the gravitas of someone who believed footnotes could save the world. He sat on a woven stool as Meritaten poured him a modest cup of lotus tea. No venom, she clarified with a chuckle, unless he was feeling particularly adventurous. He was not. I hear, he began in the tone of someone who had heard far too much that you've been distributing snake essence. Meritaten gave a serene nod as if discussing the weather. Only in homeopathic wisdom, she replied. One drop. Stirred clockwise. Always clockwise. Otherwise, the cobra spirits get dizzy. Mena blinked. He didn't know if she was joking. He wrote it down anyway. He interviewed Khufu and Rennie, who by now were enjoying their newfound fame as fever survivors. Rennie claimed the venom had made him dream of Sekhmet herself, riding a golden crocodile. Khufu described a vision in which he could see individual grains of sand all singing in unison. Mena noted this, frowned at it, underlined it, and drew a small question mark in the margin. After a few days of study and one reluctant sip of the sacred drop, which he claimed did nothing, though his cheeks turned suspiciously rosy, Mena left. But not before purchasing a small vial for documentation purposes. Naturally. Meanwhile, Meritaten's legend kept growing. A temple musician claimed his seasonal sneezing vanished after one ceremonial gulp. A baker swore her bread rose higher. A goat herder said he finally understood his animals, though no one could confirm if the goats agreed. Now let's pause for a moment. It's easy from our modern perch of vitamins and thermometers to chuckle at the idea of drinking snake venom. But remember, this was a world where the gods spoke through dreams, and healing was as much about symbolism as science. The cobra wasn't just a snake, it was protection, divine sight, and the eye of Wadjet watching from the crown of every pharaoh. To sip its essence safely, calmly, and with reverence was not simply to take medicine, it was to invite balance. to signal to one's body and to the universe, I see your heat. I acknowledge your discomfort, and I counter it with a drop of quiet power. Even the fever seemed to understand the message. Reports of symptoms, lightning fevers fading like morning mist began to fill local gossip. Of course, no one could say with certainty whether it was the venom, the honey, or simply the soothing effect of being listened to by someone with warm eyes and steady hands. But healing, as any ancient healer knew, often began the moment someone said, "Tell me how you're feeling." And Meritaten was an excellent listener. Her clinic grew busier. Not crowded Egyptians didn't like crowds unless it was a festival with free beer, but lively. People came not only for the venom, but for the stories, the tea, the sage bundles, and the faint chance of seeing a traveling scribe faint during his research sample. By the second month, her reputation had reached the curious ears of a temple priest with an obsession for divine balance, and a rather inconvenient personal fever. But that dear dreamer is a story for the next evening. So rest now under your own linen canopy. Let the Nile breeze carry away the worries of the day. And remember, in ancient Egypt, even a snake's whisper could be part of the cure. Welcome back, traveler of dreams. Let's gently return to that warm stretch of Nile where the days were long, the breezes were shy, and even fevers learned to behave under the patient care of a woman with a cobra fang and a honey jar. Now remember that temple priest I mentioned? His name was Hori. Not to be confused with that Hori, the one from the papyrus comedy plays. No, this Hori was a rather serious man with perfectly shaped eyebrows and an unusual fondness for balance. Not just the spiritual kind, he once corrected a stonemason for placing a statue of Anubis one finger length off center. He served at the temple of Maat, goddess of truth harmony, and just the right number of incense sticks per ritual. Unfortunately for Hori, Mahat could not protect him from the very mild but very irritating fever that had crept through the city like a polite house guest overstaying their welcome. At first, he tried the usual methods: cool linen wraps, prayers to Sekhmet, and a rather expensive imported salve made from figs and powdered granite. Why granite? Nobody asked, but nothing worked. His evenings were filled with light shivering and dramatic sighing, and his Quat, whom he'd named Reason, began to avoid him entirely. It was Reason, in fact, who indirectly led him to Meritaten. One morning, while trying to lure his cat back with fish and philosophical questions, Hori overheard two temple attendants whispering near the spice stall. They spoke of the woman with the snake fang, the healer who cured fevers with a drink that buzzed like the wings of a sacred bee. Hori, curious and just uncomfortable enough to be flexible, decided to investigate. He didn't go directly, of course. He sent his assistant, first a young man named Baquet, who carried 2 scrolls, a pouch of carob sweets, and a slightly panicked expression at all times. Baquet returned that afternoon looking surprisingly calm and holding a small corked jar of pale liquid. She said 1 drop, he told Hori, and only after the second moonrise prayer. She also said to chew fennel seeds afterward, or else your dreams might include judgmental cobras. Hori blinked. He was not accustomed to instructions involving chewing herbs after drinking questionable liquids. But he was a man of devotion and at this point, quite frankly, a little desperate. So he waited until the moon hung in the sky like a silver spoon, and then quietly, reverently sipped the contents of the jar. He expected many things: a sharp bitterness, a flash of divine vision, perhaps even a visit from Reason with an apology. Instead, he experienced a warm calmness, like being wrapped in a perfectly woven robe just out of the sun. The fever faded gently, without fanfare, and Hori slept that night as if the gods themselves had tucked him in. The next morning, he arrived at Meritaten's door. She was seated beneath her awning, sorting dried herbs into little bundles tied with papyrus ribbon. When she looked up, She smiled the way one does when a very important person arrives and tries not to look like they're sweating. "Ah," she said, "you must be the one with the temple cat and the granite fever cream." Hori for once laughed. They spoke for over an hour. About balance, about Sekhmet, about how healing wasn't always fire and fury. It could also be stillness, patience, and just the right amount of snake venom stirred with honey and humility. Hori admitted with the faintest trace of awe that her methods had touched something deeper than medicine. Meritaten replied that sometimes a body just needed a little help remembering how to feel normal again. Word of Hori's visit spread faster than a papyrus tax audit. Suddenly, Meritaten wasn't just a village healer, she was the healer the priests trust. Merchants from the north began arriving with trade offers. A scribe from Hermopolis offered to carve her recipes into limestone. A noblewoman sent her a letter asking if the venom helped with overthinking because her husband wouldn't stop reorganizing his sandals by color. Meritaten remained calm. She still made her brews by hand, still measured the venom with a reed spoon, and still told newcomers to chew their fennel afterward unless they wanted the dreaming snakes. She even made a small batch of lavender and venom balm for Hori, who now swore by it during evening meditations. As for Reason the temple cat, he returned, of course. Cats always do. But he did start sleeping by the venom shelf, just in case. And so my sleepy listener with one priest healed one fang still gleaming and one cat silently judging from the shadows. Our tale continues. For Meritaten's fame would soon reach the ears of someone who lived far above the riverbanks, someone with scrolls, servants, and a truly unreasonable number of golden chairs. But that is a story for another soft and silken evening. Rest easy, the cobra is coiled, the honey is stirred, and the night is long and gentle. Welcome back, sleepy traveler. Let's unfurl the scroll once more and let it carry us gently along the Nile, where whispers float like lotus petals, and even palace corridors aren't entirely immune to a bit of village gossip. It happened as most things did in ancient Egypt, through a servant who was not supposed to be listening. His name was Pamu, which means tomcat, and it suited him well. He had the lightest footsteps in the royal household and a talent for overhearing everything from royal sighs to snack orders whispered between noble cousins. One afternoon, while refilling a bowl of salted dates, Pamu overheard something curious. One of the junior scribes, yes, even scribes had scribes, was discussing a snake woman in Thebes who could calm fevers with a few drops of venom and a very specific stirring technique. Always clockwise, the scribe whispered. Otherwise, the spirits get confused. Pamu raised an eyebrow. It wasn't the strangest thing he'd heard that week. That award belonged to Prince Jehudamos, who had recently commissioned a perfume made from crushed olives and the memory of moonlight. Still Cobra Venom as medicine. That was worth a few raised sandals. And so, through a winding trail of curiosity, whispers, and 3 unnecessarily long scrolls passed between courtiers, the tale of Meritaten's remedy reached the ears of Lady Isetnofret, a high-ranking noblewoman who preferred her ceilings painted like starlight and her fevers treated before sunset. Now Lady Isetnofret was not a patient woman. Her gardens were arranged according to astrological alignment, her mirrors were polished twice a day, and her favorite pet goose had its own servant. So when she felt the first flicker of that same restless heat, the infamous river fever, she did not call the palace healer. She sent for the woman with the fang. This, of course, caused some confusion in the palace, where anything involving fangs typically involved either protective amulets or snakes being ushered briskly outside. But Lady Isetnofret insisted. Meritaten was summoned, and to everyone's mild horror, she agreed. Now you must picture this. Meritaten, calm as a clay pot in winter, arrives at the palace wearing her simple linen robes, her trusty pouch of herbs, and of course the ever-famous ivory case that held the sacred cobra Fang. She was guided through a series of increasingly gold-plated halls, past guards who didn't know whether to salute or sneeze, and finally into Lady Isitnofrit's private courtyard, where peacocks wandered aimlessly and the goose sat on a velvet cushion, judging everyone. Lady Isitnofret, reclining under a sycamore tree, looked at Meritaten the way one might look at an unusually confident bird, with curiosity and a little fear. "I was told," she said, fanning herself slowly, "that you cure fevers with poison." "Diluted poison," Meritaten corrected, smiling. "And honey. Never forget the honey." After a few rounds of ceremonial introductions, a quick blessing to Sekhmet just to be polite, and a brief discussion about whether palace air counted as humid, Meritaten got to work. She prepared the same brew she always did: 1 drop of dried venom, a swirl of honey and date juice, and a sprig of mint for flair. She offered it to Lady Isitnofret with her usual quiet nod. Now let us pause here, because this is where a very minor mishap occurred. You see, just as Lady Isitnofret lifted the cup, her pet goose, whom no one had invited to the medical ritual, honked, flapped, and leapt directly into her lap. The cup jostled, the mint sprig flew, and a rather surprised court attendant caught the full dose with his face. There was a moment of silence, then another moment of silence. Then the attendant blinked, sat down gently on a woven cushion, and announced that he had never felt so clear-headed. Meritaten, ever composed, simply said, "Well, that works too." Lady Isitnofret, amused and still quite feverish, finally drank the remainder herself. Within hours, she reported feeling much better. Within a day, she was organizing a festival. And within a week, she had written a recommendation letter that included 3 gold seals, 1 poetic metaphor, and a complimentary goose. Meritaten refused the goose. Word spread faster than honey in summer. She was now the healer trusted by nobility, and palace requests started pouring in, each with increasingly complicated requests. One official wanted a venom blend for mood swings. A priestess in Memphis wanted one for emotional clarity. Someone even asked if Cobra Venom could help with their sleep-talking parrot. Meritaten took it all in stride. She continued her work with grace, keeping her focus on the essentials: calm hands, warm tea, and one very old, very carefully preserved cobra fang. And so, from village stall to velvet courtyards, her remedy flowed sweet, strange, and swirled just right. Now, dear listener, close your eyes. Picture soft linen curtains, a bubbling pot of honey, and a healer gently measuring wisdom into a cup. The night is long, the fever is gone, and even the goose has settled. Is such. By now, Meritaten's fame was winding its way through Egypt's social layers like a well-behaved crocodile through a lotus pond. Farmers, priests, nobles, and even traveling minstrels had begun to speak of the Lady of the Golden Fang as if she were some half-mythic figure in a temple mural. Naturally, this brought her to the attention of a most curious institution, the Lesser School of Natural Curiosities, located not far from Memphis, in a building that looked suspiciously like a granary but had been repurposed after a particularly disappointing wheat season. The school was run by a handful of deeply enthusiastic scholars who believed that the world's secrets were best uncovered through long debate and longer scrolls. They had names like Hotep, son of Hotep, and Neferkau the mildly curious, and though they wore the robes of learned men, most of their knowledge came from squinting at badly preserved papyri while sipping coriander tea. When news of Meritaten's venom remedy reached their crack-tiled courtyard, they did what any self-respecting group of almost experts would do. They formed a committee. The Committee for the Investigation of Therapeutic Serpent Substances. CITSS for short, though it sounded more impressive in hieroglyphs, sent a politely worded invitation to Meritaten requesting her presence for a friendly demonstration and intellectual review. The letter was wrapped in palm bark, sealed with beeswax, and delivered by a boy who smelled strongly of date syrup. Meritaten read the invitation, rolled her eyes just slightly, and accepted. After all, she'd never been to the school, and she suspected they might need some fresh air and possibly a good foot soak. She arrived on a sunny morning, her pouch of ingredients slung over her shoulder, and her expression as serene as ever. The committee, all 5 of them, were seated behind a long table, each with a stylus, a scroll, and an expression that said, "We are ready to be surprised, but only in an organized way." They asked many questions. What is your measurement unit for 1 drop? Have you tested this on mice? On statues on mice. Shaped like statues. Is it true that the venom must be stirred clockwise because counterclockwise invites serpentine mischief? To each Meritaten gave patient answers. A reed tip. No to statues. Yes, but only on Thursdays. Then came the demonstration. She prepared the same mixture honeyed date water, a single touch of preserved venom, and a sprig of mint now slightly wilted due to academic humidity. One brave scholar, Neferkau the mildly curious, volunteered to drink it, provided he could sit in his favorite chair and hum softly afterward. He did so. And to everyone's mild astonishment, he reported a feeling of unexpected mental clarity, a gentle tingling in the toes, and the complete recollection of a dream he once had about flying baskets. The committee nodded solemnly. One wrote clarity plus baskets equals possible side benefit and underlined it 3 times. At the end of the session, Hotep son of Hotep stood and declared, "While this method lacks formal record, we can confirm its results are interesting, non-explosive, and moderately pleasant. We approve it for gentle supervised use." This in the world of ancient academia was a rousing success. As Meritaten left the school that afternoon, a scribe ran after her to ask if she'd consider writing a scroll, the herbal wisdom of the snake whisperer, perhaps. She smiled but declined. "Some things are better stirred than scribed," she said. And with that, she returned to her quiet stall where patients still lined up with hopeful eyes, fevers, and occasionally goats. Now as you lie here wrapped in your own cotton or linen, or simply the soft weight of the night, remember that even the brightest minds sometimes need a sip of mystery and a pinch of mint. By this time in our tale, you might assume everything was going smoothly for Meritaten. She had the respect of the people, the admiration of a few overly dramatic priests, and the cautious endorsement of scholars who wore sandals indoors and called it methodology. But peace in Egypt or anywhere else rarely lasts without at least one odd interruption. It happened on a cool morning when the breeze off the river still carried the scent of mint and wet clay. A man named Panahesi arrived at Meritaten's stall. He wore a fine robe, too many bracelets, and the face of someone who practiced smiling in polished bronze. He introduced himself as a humble merchant of medical wares, which in this case meant he sold odd powders in tiny ceramic jars and claimed they could reverse aging or cure melancholy caused by crocodile dreams. He had heard, he said, of her miraculous snake-based brew, and he was curious, very curious, too curious. He asked to observe her process. She declined politely. He offered silver rings and promises of joint ventures. She declined less politely. He returned the next day with a basket of gifts, including what he called a ceremonial cobra whistle. It was shaped like a duck and made a noise somewhere between a sneeze and a regret. She declined that too. And so Panahesi, not used to being told no, decided on a new strategy. That night, under the disguise of darkness and a scarf that was far too silky to be stealthy, he crept toward Meritaten's workshop. He tiptoed past sleeping goats, tiptoed past a deeply unimpressed ibis, and reached the shelves where she kept her venom vials and notes wrapped in papyrus bundles. He was just about to snatch a scroll titled Doses and Dreams when something hissed. Now Meritaten didn't keep a guard dog. She kept something far more effective. A snake. A real one. Alive, sleepy, and absolutely not in the mood. You see, Meritaten had long understood the value of symbolism, and while she never used venom from living snakes, hers was always preserved. She did on occasion allow one friendly cobra named Marira to curl up in a sunlit basket near her door, mostly for ambiance, partly for security. Panahasi froze. The hiss was soft, yes, but unmistakable. He turned very slowly and found himself eye to eye with Marira, whose tongue flicked out with the authority of a royal tax inspector. And then came Meritaten's voice, smooth and calm as ever, from behind him. You know, she said most people ask for the recipe. You didn't have to bring the duck. Panahasi, to his credit, did not scream, but he did drop the scroll, the duck whistle, and his pride all in one swift movement. The next morning, he was seen purchasing basil and acting as if nothing had happened. Meritaten, being generous, chose not to speak of it again. But she did name her next batch of medicine the Merchant's Lesson. It sold out in a week. From then on, no one attempted to steal her secrets. Partly because of the hiss. Mostly because of the understanding that true healing wasn't something you could bottle, label, and sell with a duck-shaped whistle. It was ritual, intention, trust, and a little bit of cobra wisdom. So now, as you lie still tucked beneath your own papyrus skies, remember not all secrets need stealing. Some will come to you in their own time, quietly, like a story told just before sleep. Now, dear listener, we turn our gaze just a little beyond the Nile, because news, especially curious, half-believed, honey-drenched news, has a habit of traveling. And one day, it reached a man who wore far too much turquoise and smelled like imported cedar oil. His name was Daniel. He was not Egyptian. He was from Byblos, sent as an ambassador to maintain trade, deliver gifts, and more importantly, avoid sunburn. He spoke fluent Middle Egyptian, though his accent made Sekhmet sound like spaghetti, and he had a deep affection for linen robes that matched his camels. Daniel had developed what he described rather dramatically as a plague of perspiration. A local physician called it a minor fever. Daniel insisted it was divine punishment for overindulging in melon wine. Either way, he was uncomfortable. And when he heard whispers of a woman who cured fevers with cobra venom, he adjusted his turquoise bangles and asked for a private appointment. Meritaten, who by now had seen everything from noble women with ticklish noses to men who believed their dreams had been stolen by birds, welcomed Daniel with her usual calm. She offered him a stool, a cold cloth, and a cup of calming date leaf tea, while he explained in extensive detail the tragic saga of his sweating. She listened patiently. He asked nervously whether the venom caused sudden musical hallucinations. She said no. He then asked whether it might give a man visions of his grandmother waving fish. She said that had only happened once, and it may have involved too much cinnamon. Finally, he asked with great ceremony to try the remedy. Meritaten smiled, measured a drop, stirred clockwise, added honey, and handed him the cup with both hands like passing on a secret. He drank. He paused. He blinked. It tastes like brave syrup, he said. She nodded. Good. Then it's working. Daniel stayed for 2 days, mostly to confirm he wasn't seeing ancestral fish. When he left, he declared Meritaten a treasure greater than cedar, which in Byblos was very high praise indeed. More importantly, he took the story back with him, though in his version there were at least 2 snakes involved, one of which danced. Back in Thebes, Meritaten went about her days unaware that her fame was now spreading through Phoenician port towns. Traders began arriving not with illness, but with scrolls asking for the secret of brave syrup. One even offered her a basket of oysters in exchange for the recipe. She politely declined, citing a strong dislike of mollusks. And so, the tale of healing through serpent venom began to take on a life of its own. It slipped through marketplaces, echoed in bathhouses, and found its way into murals that were probably meant to depict temple festivals but now featured suspiciously snake-like hieroglyphs. Back in her stall, surrounded by herbs, oils, and the occasional sleepy cobra, Meritaten continued to stir her mixtures with care, never rushing, always humming. She did not chase fame. She stirred it slowly, like medicine in honey, letting it settle where it may. And you, dear listener, may now do the same. Let your thoughts drift. Let your breath slow. Let the foreign ambassadors, fevered goats, and honey-sweet remedies blur gently into dreams. By this point, Meritaten's reputation was woven into the very fabric of Thebes. If you followed the scent of date bread and the sound of gentle laughter, you would likely find someone telling the story of the healer with the fang, usually while sipping tea or pretending not to nap in the shade. So it came as no surprise that when preparations began for the annual festival of Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and heat, and occasionally roaring very loudly, Meritaten was asked to participate. It involved music rituals and quite a bit of celebratory beer, so much so that temple scribes once lost 3 scrolls to a tipsy drummer who mistook the archive room for a closet. There were offerings, blessings, and dancers dressed in lioness masks who performed ceremonial steps under the blazing sun. Meritaten stood beside a low stone altar dressed in white with a sash embroidered in gold thread. The cobra fang, polished and placed on a small pedestal, gleamed in the sunlight. She stirred her mixture with deliberate calm venom, honey mint, and a drop of rosewater added for ceremonial flair. The music changed tempo. You see, a young flute player new to the temple band had never performed during a Sekhmet festival before. In his nervousness, he skipped 2 lines of the melody and accidentally began playing a tune reserved for snake dancing, which to the trained cobra in Meritaten's basket was very familiar. And Meritaten, bless her composure, simply nodded and said, "Ah, yes, and now, the sacred response." She kept stirring. The cobra kept swaying. The crowd assumed it was all part of the ceremony. The priests, seeing the crowd's enthusiasm, joined in with rhythmic clapping. And thus, quite by accident, the blessing of the swirling fang became a regular feature of the festival. From that year forward, it was said that if the cobra danced, your illness didn't stand a chance. When the music finally resolved into the proper hymn, Merira settled back into her basket, completely unbothered. The potion was distributed in tiny ceremonial cups. Only a symbolic drop, of course, and everyone went home convinced they had witnessed something divine, or at the very least, delightfully different. Meritaten later told the flute player he'd done wonderfully. Then she quietly suggested he perhaps consider a slower tempo next time, unless he wanted to wake the goddess in a dancing mood. And so, the healer's legend grew again, not by force, not by fame hunting, but by presence, by stillness, by a snake's gentle rhythm, and a woman who stirred change into honey. Now rest, dear dreamer. Let the music fade. Let the cobra return to her basket, and let your mind drift softly into a night of calm and curiosity. One quiet evening, long after the echoes of the festival drums had faded into the reeds, Meritaten sat beneath her reed awning, sorting fennel seeds and enjoying the kind of breeze that made you want to cancel all your responsibilities and stare at ducks. It had been a peaceful day. Only 3 patients. One philosophical debate about whether hiccups were caused by offended spirits, and one visit from an elderly woman who claimed she needed cobra venom to sharpen her dreams. Meritaten gave her mint tea instead. The woman returned the next day reporting vivid visions of flying cats. Meritaten made a note to reduce the mint. But as she was tidying her herbs, a short, round man in a mustard yellow tunic approached. He introduced himself as Jehuti Hotep, interpreter of dreams and minor ailments, from a village upriver where most medical advice came from goats and family tradition. He carried a scroll, a very large scroll. It was tied with 3 cords and appeared to be slightly smudged with fig jam. "I have," he declared, "recorded the dream symptoms of 27 patients who drank something very similar to your potion, and I believe it has dream-shifting properties," which is either magnificent or mildly alarming. Meritaten, ever gracious, invited him to sit. He did so, but the scroll made a soft whump, and then a second, softer noise. It seemed to sigh. Or perhaps that was Jehuti Hotep. He unrolled it halfway and began to read. Case 12, he said, reported dreaming of a sunlit desert where the snakes wore sandals. Case 14 claimed to hear distant laughter and awoke humming a song from their childhood. Case 19 asked if they were allowed to fall in love with the wind. Meritaten raised an eyebrow. And these are side effects. Oh no, he said these are bonuses. The two spent the next hour sipping lotus tea and comparing notes. Jehuti Hotep admitted that while his scrolls were mostly anecdotal, the patterns were intriguing. Patients reported more restful sleep, reduced fever, and most curiously, dreams that were both memorable and oddly uplifting. This Meritaten explained might be due to the honey mint mixture rather than the venom itself. Or perhaps it was simply the act of drinking something with care and intention, followed by a deep breath and the belief that healing had begun. By the end of their conversation, Jehuti Hotep had proposed co-authoring a scroll called Cobra Dreams, a study of gentle rest and mild hallucinations. Meritaten smiled and agreed, provided he used fewer adjectives and let her title the footnotes. She had always wanted to write a footnote that began with the phrase, surprisingly, the goose was not involved. They parted as friends with promises to send updates by carrier Ibis. And so the legend of the Fang now included not just healing and festivals, but dreams, guided by drops of wisdom, stirred in clockwise circles and sealed with trust. Tonight, as your own dreams begin to stir beneath your eyelids, remember not all potions are for the body. Some, the best ones, are stirred for the soul. Now hush, the scroll is snoring. Eventually, as with all great healers, the question came, when will you take an apprentice? It came first from Khufu, who brought it up while chewing on tamarind bread. Then from Hori, the temple priest, who offered a short list of young people with good eyebrows and decent handwriting. Even the palace scribe sent her a message written entirely in metaphors. The lotus must teach the lily before the flood season arrives. Meritaten had considered it before, of course, but training someone in the sacred art of calm hands, correct venom dosage, and not sneezing into the potion required more than interest. It required stillness, patience, someone who wouldn't try to mix things just to see what happened. Enter Beck. Beck was enthusiastic. He appeared one morning with a reed basket full of lemons, 2 different shoes, and a grin that looked permanent. He had heard of the famous Cobra remedy and wanted very earnestly to help stir the truth into the tea. It was a nice line. He'd written it on his tunic. Meritaten eyed the basket of lemons. What are these for? Experiments, he said. Also, I heard cobras like citrus. That might be fake. She almost sent him away. Almost. But there was something in his sincerity in the way he tilted his head when she explained the clockwise stirring that convinced her to try. Just for a day. The first thing he did was trip over a sleeping cat. The second thing he did was drop a sealed jar of dried scorpion tail powder, harmless, but the cloud it produced made everyone's noses itch for an hour. The third thing he did was unexpected. He caught Marira the cobra halfway up a shelf, gently guided her back into her basket, and whispered, "You're not supposed to be climbing without a permit." Meritaten stared. He smiled. She looked bored, and so Beck stayed. He learned quickly how to grind herbs without bruising them, how to fold linen packets just right, how to tell the difference between sleepy patients and those simply avoiding chores. He was also very good at talking to the plants. Whether they listened was unclear, but the mint grew faster when he sang. One afternoon, Meritaten asked him to prepare a small demonstration batch of the Cobra remedy for a visiting nobleman. She gave him precise instructions, reminded him twice not to overheat the honey, and left for the herb garden. 10 minutes later, she heard a scream. Not from a person, from Beck. When she rushed back, she found him surrounded by ants, hundreds of them marching cheerfully across the work table, heading straight for the tiny bowl of venom and honey mixture. "I only turned my back for a second," Beck cried. "1 second. They're coordinated." Meritaten, holding back a laugh, calmly placed a piece of bread soaked in vinegar a few paces away. The ants, convinced they had found dessert, part 2, politely changed course. She looked at Beck. He looked at the nearly ant-eaten remedy. "I'll remake it," he said. She nodded. "And this time, cover it with a leaf." From that day on, he never left a mixture unattended. He also developed a deep respect for ants. As for Meritaten, she realized that perhaps her legacy didn't need to be etched in temple stone. Maybe it was enough to pass it on to someone who would someday stir with the same care, the same silence, and the same sense of humor when everything went mildly sideways. And so the healer had a helper. The Fang had a future. And the ants, they never came back. Possibly because Marira started sleeping closer to the jars. So rest now under your own safe canopy. Let the ants march elsewhere. Let the apprentice learn. And let the healer rest, knowing her knowledge was no longer hers alone. By the time the summer sun had returned for its yearly full performance, brighter, louder, and more determined than any goose Meritaten's name had become something of a lullaby across Upper Egypt. Children were told, "Drink your tea or the cobra healer will frown," which was ironic considering Meritaten almost never frowned. Not even when she accidentally drank an herbal blend meant to treat goats. That, dear listener, is a story for another time. This particular story begins with the quietest day Meritaten had seen in years. It started like any other. The geese were squabbling at dawn about something deeply philosophical. Beck believed it was bread crusts. Meritaten suspected envy. The herbs had dried just right in the morning light. Marira, her cobra companion, was curled into a perfect meditative spiral. Everything was in its place. And yet, no one came. No patients with fevers. No travelers with mystery rashes. No nobles with dramatically imagined ailments involving celestial misalignment and itchy knees. No distant cousins claiming to be healers in training, asking for recipes. Not even a wandering priest hoping to trade blessings for balm. Nothing. Just stillness. Beck arrived a bit late, carrying a papyrus fan he'd built himself, and absolutely no sense of urgency. "Strange air this morning," he said, sitting down without ceremony. "Even the birds are whispering." He looked around. Did everyone get cured overnight? Meritaten smiled faintly. Maybe Sekhmet's feeling generous. He poured tea. They drank in silence. The quiet wasn't heavy. It was soft, like a linen sheet dried in the breeze. "Should we do inventory?" he asked. She nodded. They began sorting the herbs. Peppermint still fragrant. Tamarind slices just the right color. The preserved Cobra Venom 3 sealed jars left. Each drop carefully dried, measured, powdered, and stored in tightly rolled linen. Beside them sat the Fang, still resting in its ivory case, unchanged and somehow eternal. Not dangerous, not magical, just respected. They dusted the jars, cleaned the shelves, relabeled the bundles with fresh ink. Still no footsteps, still no visitors. Beck sat back with a sigh. "It's peaceful." "It is," she said, "and rare." He turned eyes glinting. "Do you think this is what healing looks like?" She didn't answer right away. She simply leaned back, looking at the canopy of reeds above their tips fluttering like gossiping hands. "Maybe healing isn't just curing," she said at last. "Maybe it's the silence that comes after." Beck thought for a long while. That sounds like something worth writing on a scroll. She raised an eyebrow. Only if it rhymes. That afternoon, a small girl passed by their stall. No illness, just curiosity. She peeked at the herbs, the jars, and especially at Marira, who lifted her head as if to say yes in fluent Cobra. "Is it true," the girl asked, "that you make people better with poison?" Meritaten chuckled. "With care, and honey, and time." The girl nodded, deeply satisfied. Then she asked for some mint just in case. Meritaten wrapped a sprig in linen, handed it to her, and watched as she skipped away humming. Later, as the sun began to dip into its evening robe, a pair of farmers passed by with baskets of figs. They waved. She waved back. No fevers, no fatigue, just figs. Beck looked around again. It really is the quietest day. Meritaten, sipping tea, replied, and perhaps the most important. Because you see, for all the scrolls and scholars and ceremonies, sometimes the greatest moment in a healer's life is not the curing of a prince or the decoding of a dream, but the day when no one needs you. Not because you're forgotten, but because for that moment, however brief, the balance has held. The fever had slowed. The river had risen just enough. The people were resting. The cobra was napping. Even the geese had taken a break from their usual dramatic commentary. And in that stillness, the healer could finally breathe, not as someone fixing, but as someone who had helped the world remember itself. That night, they lit a small clay lamp, not for ritual, just because the sky was turning violet and the stars deserved some company. Beck wrote a line in his journal, "Today we did nothing. It felt like everything." Meritaten added, "No venom, just peace." And somewhere in the soft folds of dusk, the scent of mint and honey drifted into the night, curling over rooftops, into dreams across fields and temples and sleepy goats. You may not remember this part in the morning, but tonight it's here for you. A day of healing, a day of quiet, a day where absolutely nothing happened. And that was exactly the miracle. The morning after the day of silence, a man arrived at the edge of Meritaten's herb stall with a pair of sandals so shiny they reflected sunlight directly into Beck's eyes. He wore a tunic that had never met a wrinkle and a beard oiled to the point of suspicion. In his hand he carried a scroll sealed with blue wax and smelling faintly of lavender and ambition. "I am Nebamun," he said, "of the House of Trade and Luxuries." Beck immediately suspected trouble. Nebamun, as it turned out, was a merchant not of spices or cloth, but of ideas. He believed in taking things usually gentle, natural, slow things, and convincing them they'd be much happier in jars. Then selling them in bulk to people who liked shouting words like exclusive and limited series. And he had heard of Meritaten's remedy. Oh yes, he had heard about the Cobra Venom, the stirring the temple festivals, the geese. He was particularly curious about the geese branding opportunities. And now he had come with a proposal. "I wish," he said with a flourishing bow, "to help you share your remedy with all of Egypt. Bottled, packaged, labeled with your face, possibly scented." Meritaten blinked, slowly. "Share it," she repeated. "Exactly," Nebamun said, pulling out a miniature clay jar with gold paint smeared around the rim. "We can call it Drop of the Fang Tem, a single sip for health dreams and other marketable outcomes." Beck leaned in. "Does it come with goose feathers?" Nebamun looked startled. "If that's part of the brand, yes." Meritaten, to her credit, didn't laugh. Nor did she immediately say no. She poured tea instead, real tea, not branded, and invited him to sit. They talked. Nebamun was clever. Not wicked, not rude, just very fast. He spoke of expansion, distribution influence. He listed names of noble households, possible endorsements from priests, and a proposed line of scrolls titled The Healing of the Fang, Ancient Secrets, Modern Convenience. He was even prepared to invest in a cart with painted wheels. When he finally finished 27 minutes later, Beck counted Meritaten, set down her tea, looked at him gently, and said, "You know, healing doesn't scale very well." Nebamun paused. "I'm sorry." She continued, voice soft. "This remedy isn't just about ingredients. It's about the moment, the stillness, the trust. You can't bottle the way someone exhales after weeks of fever, or the silence before the first sip, or the feeling of a hand stirring something just for you." Nebamun opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Beck handed him a piece of bread. Meritaten smiled. "I don't mind that you asked, but this isn't meant to be rushed or replicated. It's not a miracle in a jar. It's a ritual. And rituals don't like factories. For a moment, Nebamun seemed smaller, not defeated, just reconsidering. He sipped his tea. Is this part of the treatment, he asked. No, Beck said. That's just tea. He nodded. It's very good. They shared a quiet moment. The geese wandered by unimpressed. Marira the cobra uncurled slightly and blinked once in Nebamun's direction as if adding a silent vote of caution. By mid-afternoon, Nebamun packed his scrolls. He thanked them both, left a small vial of imported lavender oil as a gift, and walked away a bit slower than when he had arrived. They never saw him again. But a week later, a clay tablet arrived by courier. No branding, no offer, just one line etched carefully. Some remedies are meant for one cup at a time. Thank you for the reminder. Beck smiled when he read it. That's the nicest rejection letter I've ever seen. Meritaten chuckled. Maybe he'll go start a tea stall. As the sun dipped behind the palms, Beck began sketching a small sign for their own table. Just for fun. He wrote no branding, no shouting. Just a drop stirred slowly. Then underneath in smaller letters, geese not for sale. And that evening, under the soft lull of frog song and wind-tickled reeds, the healer and her apprentice sipped mint tea stirred without urgency and felt no need to be anywhere else. Because some things are not meant to be mass-produced. They're meant to be remembered. And you, dear listener, may now tuck that memory into your own quiet. No trademark needed. It had been nearly a year since Beck first showed up with uneven sandals and far too many lemons. In that time, he had grown from an over-enthusiastic leaf smasher into a respectable assistant healer. He still talked to the mint plants, yes, but now they seemed to listen. He could prepare most mixtures without supervision. He knew the shelf order of every dried herb. He no longer confused powdered ginger with crushed wasp shells, a mistake we do not speak of. And he had finally, after weeks of practice, mastered the art of stirring Cobra Venom into honeyed tea without splashing any onto the floor or himself. Which is why one unusually windy morning he made a bold declaration. I think I can improve the recipe. Meritaten looked up from her scroll work with the expression of someone who had heard that exact sentence before, usually right before something exploded, fermented, or required sweeping. Improve, she echoed. Beck straightened his shoulders, which by now had tanned from months under the sun and geese. I've been experimenting. Just a little. What if we added a touch of cinnamon for warmth? And maybe a tiny drop of lotus sap for dream enhancement. You want to make snake venom cozier? She asked. Yes, he said proudly. Cozier and more fragrant. Meritaten paused. Then in the gentlest voice she could manage said, All right, 1 cup, no patience, no goats watching. And the geese must sign off. The geese predictably were indifferent. So Beck got to work. He pulled out a small bowl, measured a drop of powdered venom with perfect care, added the honey just a touch more than usual, and stirred clockwise. Then came the cinnamon, which he dusted on with the flair of a man trying to impress no one but the wind gods. The lotus sap, however, was trickier. It was sticky pale and known for enhancing dreams or causing mildly prophetic hiccups depending on the person. Beck added 1 drop. Just 1. He stirred, slowly, deliberately. Clockwise as always. The mixture turned a soft golden color with a hint of shimmer. He sniffed it. Delightful. He took a sip, then blinked, then smiled. Not bad, he said. Very warm, very floaty. Meritaten raised one brow, floaty. I feel like my thoughts are pillows, he replied. She took the cup gently from his hands and set it down. Sit, she said. I am, he replied, though he was actually standing. He sat. She observed. His pulse was normal. His pupils were wide, but only a little. He began to hum a song he claimed he'd never heard before. It's not a bad feeling, he insisted. I just wouldn't use this on anyone who needs to operate a cart. The effects wore off after an hour. No dizziness, no trouble. Just an odd desire to write poetry about clouds. The next day, Beck returned to the original recipe without protest. He labeled his cinnamon lotus version with a warning for experimental dreams only, not recommended near staircases. Still, he'd learned something. Not just about venom or herbs or the volatility of untested floral saps, but about respect. The original mixture wasn't powerful because of its flavor, or its heat, or even its ingredients. It was powerful because of the way it was prepared, with intention, with ritual, with centuries of wisdom tucked into every clockwise motion of the spoon. That afternoon, Beck wrote a new entry in his notebook. "The gods do not mind creativity," he wrote, "but they prefer you ask first." Meritaten, watching from across the stall, said nothing, but she smiled. And when the sun dipped behind the palm trees and the wind tugged at the edges of the reed awning, she handed him the stirring spoon and said, "Tomorrow you lead." Beck blinked. "Me? You've earned it." He looked at the spoon like it was a staff of royal power, then without thinking stirred the air in front of him. Clockwise. And somewhere perhaps Sekhmet chuckled. So tonight, dear listener, as you curl beneath your blankets and drift into your own dream experiments, remember this. You can add cinnamon to life. You can try a drop of lotus in your story, but always stir slowly, always clockwise. And when in doubt, ask the geese. They don't know everything, but they never forget a good mistake. It had been nearly 2 years since Meritaten first stirred Cobra Venom into honeyed tea beneath a palm-woven awning on the edge of Thebes. In that time, she had cured fevers, answered questions about sneezing, goats, gently declined several royal job offers, and mentored an apprentice who now spent more time humming than talking. And then something even stranger happened. People stopped getting sick. Not entirely, of course. A stubbed toe here, a cough there, the occasional case of "I ate a papyrus" scroll on a dare, but the long stretches of fever, the waves of sweating visitors seeking comfort, the nervous temple envoys asking for blessings, they all faded. Some said Sekhmet was pleased. Others said the river was behaving itself for once. Beck said it was the mint's doing. Meritaten just smiled. And one day in the stillness of early summer, when the frogs had finally stopped singing for exactly 5 minutes, an idea floated across the tea table like the scent of dried basil. "We should have a festival," Beck said. Meritaten blinked. "For what?" "For not being sick," he replied as if it were the most obvious reason in the world. "A festival of thanks. No fire rituals, no screaming, just appreciation." She stared at him. "Also," he added, "I've been practicing the lute." Ah, of course. And so over the next few weeks, something quietly beautiful began to take shape, not because of temple edicts or royal orders, but because people wanted to say thank you, not with statues or scrolls, just with time, and maybe a little music. Beck made a sign, the first annual festival of feverless thanks. All are welcome, even the goose. The date was chosen based on the lunar calendar, the availability of figs, and Marira's molting schedule. People brought offerings not of gold or papyrus, but of stories. A woman from across the river brought a woven mat she had made while recovering from her fever using reed patterns she said came to her in a dream. A boy brought a necklace of tiny shells, each one representing a day he'd felt better than the last. Someone anonymously left a bundle of herbs tied with ribbon and a note that read simply, "Thank you for giving my father back his laugh." No one claimed credit. No one gave long speeches. They just came, sat in the shade, drank tea, listened to Beck play his lute, which despite his confidence sounded like 2 frogs arguing under a basket. But somehow it was perfect. The geese wore wreaths. Even Marira emerged from her basket and curled herself around the base of the offering table like a priestess in nap formation. Then came the most surprising moment. Hori, the dignified priest of Ma'at, arrived with a scroll tucked under his arm. He bowed to Meritaten, then read aloud, "We give thanks not only for healing, but for the reminder that silence can be sacred." that a cup of sweetness stirred with care holds more meaning than any statue built in haste. He paused, then added a bit sheepishly, also my joints haven't hurt in months, and I think it's your tea. Laughter rippled like warm wind over the courtyard. Meritaten for once allowed herself a full smile, the kind that starts deep in the chest and takes its time reaching the eyes. She stood and simply said, healing is not always about what we remove. Sometimes it's about what we make room for. Then she handed everyone more tea. That night, as lanterns flickered and people drifted home with bellies full of dates and hearts full of quiet, Beck sat beside her and whispered, "Do you think we'll do this again next year?" Meritaten looked around the soft rustle of leaves, the gentle clinking of cups, the stars blinking above like drowsy scribes. "If no one's sick again next year," she said absolutely. Beck nodded, then added, "Maybe I'll write a song for the geese." "Maybe don't," she said. But even the geese didn't object. And that dear dreamer is how a healer who never sought attention and a boy who once tried to flavor venom with lemon peels ended up starting a festival not to cure, not to plead, but simply to thank. Thank the days that passed without worry. Thank the herbs that grew just right. Thank the gods, if they were listening, for letting silence linger a little longer. So as you drift now into your own quiet, let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. And let yourself be grateful for warmth, for rest, and for those who know when to stir and when to simply sit. Just after the first festival of feverless thanks, when the garlands had wilted and the geese had returned to arguing over who owned the shade, a new visitor arrived at Meritaten's stall. He came alone, walking with the cautious speed of a man who had studied too many dusty scrolls and not enough shoes. His name was Pacer, and he was a professional transcriber from the Southern Archives at Waset. His eyebrows were long, his sandals were square, and he introduced himself with all the formality of someone who believed ink held more truth than sunlight. "I have heard," he said, unrolling a scroll so long it brushed the floor of your remedy, "of the venom, the ritual, the goat-related interruption during the first demonstration, and of the festival. And I believe it must be written." Beck squinted. Written where? Pacer's eyes gleamed. Everywhere. Now Meritaten had received many offers before, merchants wanting to bottle her brews, nobles asking to name their children after her, and once a farmer who requested she bless his donkey because it had recently stopped biting strangers. But this was new. Pacer wanted to document everything, every recipe, every ritual, every stirring motion. He even brought a small clay device he called a recipe stamp, which looked suspiciously like a chicken footprint dipped in ink. Beck was intrigued. "Will we be famous?" Meritaten raised an eyebrow. "We already have geese. That's fame enough." Still, she allowed the scribe to observe. For 3 days and 3 nights, though truthfully, the nights were mostly naps, Pacer sat quietly in the corner, scribbling furiously. He recorded how Beck measured herbs by pinching them between finger and thumb and muttering things like, "not too much, or you'll float." He sketched Merira the cobra curled in her sunbasket, labeled her guardian of fang proportions. He even tried to interview a goose, though it ended with a slightly torn scroll and a faint hiss of disapproval. At the end of his stay, Pacer returned with a bound compilation titled "The Song of the Venom, a Healer's Manual for the Curious and Slightly Brave." Inside were instructions, illustrations, and a few poetic verses that Beck insisted on adding, including, "One drop stirred with purpose true will calm the fire that burns in you, but stir it left. The geese will know and chase you back to Thebes in tow." Meritaten flipped through it. It was charming, well written, mostly accurate, though she did pause at one illustration that showed her riding a cobra through clouds. "What is this?" Symbolism, Pacer whispered. She sighed. "Promise me," she said gently, "you'll add a note at the beginning. Something honest." He tilted his head. "Like what?" She looked toward the horizon where the reeds were swaying softly in the wind and said that this is not a book of miracles. It's a book of memory. The medicine is in the moment, not the mix. In the way the spoon moves. In the quiet before the sip. Passer nodded slowly, then wrote, "This scroll does not promise healing. It promises a story." He bowed deeply. Marira blinked once in approval. Even the geese remained still for at least a full minute. And with that, he left. Weeks later, copies of the Song of the Venom began appearing in markets and temple libraries. Not many, just a few. Passed hand to hand, each one handwritten, each one just slightly different because, as Passer had written in his afterword, no two drops are stirred alike. One version added a chapter on the geese's daily schedule. One translated Beck's poems into song. One had a recipe for tea that made your ears feel cooler during summer. But none claimed a cure. They offered instead something rarer, a ritual, a rhythm, a reason to sit down, be still, and remember that healing sometimes is simply the act of slowing down. That evening, Beck made tea while humming his favorite verse. Meritaten adjusted the reed canopy. The sky turned soft with twilight, and across the Nile, someone read their copy of the Song of the Venom by lamplight and smiled. Because even without drinking a single drop, they felt better. So tonight, let that be your medicine too. Not the venom, not even the honey, just the story. Spoken softly, stirred slowly, and left to settle where it matters most. It was sometime near the festival of the third moon, when the nights grew longer and the frogs sang in strange harmonies, that a visitor arrived who didn't belong to the Nile at all. He came at dusk, wearing a tunic of strange cloth that shimmered somehow without light. His skin was dusted with a silver sheen, and he smelled not of sand or sweat or sage, but of something like metal, or maybe starlight. His name was Panetcher. At least that's what he told Beck, who found him standing politely next to the goosenap zone, looking curiously at a jar of peppermint oil. "I come from the edge of the sky," the man said calmly, "to learn about the healing of the fang." Beck, who had once attempted to boil tea using moonlight, did not find this strange. He brought the man to Meritaten without fuss. He might be from the stars, he said, or maybe just very poetic. Panetcher bowed deeply. "Your remedy is known even in places where maps end." Meritaten, who had just finished slicing dried fig bark, looked up. "Really, I only ever meant it for sore villagers." He nodded solemnly. "The story travels faster than any bird. We heard it echo from a scroll recited by wind." She blinked. "You heard it. On the wind." It rhymed, he said, as if that explained everything. Now Meritaten had long ago stopped questioning the oddness of the world. After the 8th noblewoman asked if Cobra Venom could improve romantic clarity, she decided to simply accept what came as long as it wasn't rude or on fire. So she made him tea. Not with venom, of course. Just her usual honey mint and a pinch of wisdom. They sat, they drank, and then he asked, "Will you teach me how to make it?" She paused, then said gently, "Tell me what you think it is first." He thought for a while, then replied, "A ritual that invites the body to rest and the soul to remember how to be quiet." Beck dropped his spoon. "That's better than what I wrote," he muttered. Meritaten smiled. "Then you already understand." Still, over the next few days, she showed him the process, not to bottle it, not to sell it, but to feel it. They harvested herbs in the morning dew, dried mint in shaded baskets, stirred honey into warm water until it shimmered like river light. She even let him touch the old cobra fang, which he held with deep reverence, murmuring something in a language that sounded like slow wind over stone. He never took notes. He said he wouldn't need to. He watched. He listened. He helped Beck label a jar, which he insisted on writing in spiral script that looped in on itself like a snake dreaming of its own tail. The villagers didn't mind him. Some thought he was a wandering priest from the western desert. Others said he was just very quiet and very good at listening. One child asked if he had a star under his tongue. He didn't answer. On the fourth night, as frogs sang in 3 different rhythms, and even the geese had fallen into uneasy truce, Penetcher stood by the edge of the herb garden and said softly, "I must go now." Where to, Beck asked. "The same direction as the wind that brought me," which again did not clarify anything. Still, Meritaten handed him a small wrapped packet, dried mint, a sliver of honey crystal, and a folded leaf with a single dot of powdered venom. "Just enough to remember," she said. He bowed deeper this time. "You are what the stars forgot to write," he said. Then he walked into the night. No cart, no sandals, just a hush of footsteps and a shimmer that seemed to fade before the moon noticed. The next morning, the packet he'd been given was found under the shade of the fig tree, unopened, perfectly tied. Beck stared at it. "Do you think he was real?" Meritaten, placing it gently into a clay jar, replied, "All healing is a little imaginary. That doesn't make it less true." That afternoon, the wind blew from a new direction. It carried the scent of mint, and far above the clouds, a thin streak of silver curved across the sky as if someone had stirred the heavens, clockwise. So now, as you lie back beneath your own sky, let yourself imagine. Maybe somewhere out there, someone is sipping a warm cup of silence mixed with honey and stardust, thinking of you, and smiling. It began as most strange things along the Nile did, with the sound of frogs suddenly not singing. This in itself wasn't alarming. Frogs often took short breaks from their nightly symphonies to rest their vocal cords or argue about mosquitoes. But on this particular evening, as Meritaten poured warm water into her herb bowl and Beck attempted again to invent a goose-proof tea strainer, something was undeniably still. No frogs, no wind. Even the reeds, usually eager to whisper nonsense to each other, stood upright like stunned scribes. Then came the river, or rather the lack of it. Not a drought, not a flood, not a curse from a half-forgotten god of soggy sandals. Just stillness. The river had stopped flowing. Not everywhere, of course. The Nile was still very much present, but for several miles near Thebes it simply paused, held its breath, like a storyteller leaning in before the punchline. Beck noticed first staring at the waterline while trying to refill the goose's drinking bowl, which for reasons no one understood was a miniature wine jar. "It's like the river's meditating," he said. Meritaten peered over. The surface was smooth as a sheet of pressed linen, not a single ripple. Even the reflections looked surprised. Villagers gathered quietly, as if afraid sound might offend the water. Some whispered that Sobek had blinked. Others claimed it was the work of foreign sorcerers jealous of their smooth-skinned fish. Only one elder, a retired fisherman named Teti, had a different theory. "She did it," he said, pointing at Meritaten with a trembling fig loaf. "The snake woman. She made the river calm." Meritaten, who was currently measuring mint leaves into neat bundles, raised an eyebrow. "I've barely stirred anything today." "No matter," Teddy said. "You've cured fevers, healed goats, calmed nobles, and once made a priest sneeze politely. Now you've cured the Nile of its temper." Beck leaned over. "Do rivers have fevers?" "Only when they're angry," Teddy replied. Word spread faster than a startled ibis. By nightfall, small offerings began appearing at Meritaten's stall. Fish-shaped breads, lotus petals, a particularly large yam with a smile drawn on it. Beck tried to return them. "We didn't do anything," he insisted. But people shook their heads. Sometimes doing nothing is the greatest magic, they said. The river remained still for 2 full days. Fishermen sat in boats staring into the glassy surface as if hoping for advice. Children used it as a mirror, giggling at their upside-down noses. One man proposed marriage, claiming the river's calm was a sign that the timing was finally right. She said no citing poor sandal choices. On the 3rd day, Meritaten woke early, stepped to the bank, and placed a small offering of mint and honey on a floating reed tray. No chant, no ritual, just a whisper. "Whatever you are, thank you for the pause." Moments later, the river moved again. Not dramatically, not in a rush, just resumed. as if someone had finally exhaled. Ripples returned, reeds resumed their gossip, frogs cleared their throats and launched into a musical number that may have involved interpretive croaking. That evening, Teddy returned bowed deeply and presented Meritaten with a fish carved from date wood. To remember the river that rested, he said. She placed it on her shelf beside the fang. No one asked her for medicine that day, or the next. They came instead with questions like, how did you ask the river so nicely? Do you think the Nile just needed a nap? Can you calm my cousin? He's louder than the frogs. Meritaten answered gently as she always did. Balance comes when you stop pushing. Even rivers need to be listened to. Beck tried to write a poem about it. The first line was promising. Still flows the river when hearts learn to pause. The rest turned into a metaphor about fish feelings, and he quietly abandoned it. That night, they sat by the riverbank sipping tea made from lemongrass and river mint. The air was heavy with the warmth of day, but soft now like a cloak laid carefully on your shoulders. Beck stretched his legs. Do you think it'll happen again? Meritaten shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. But if it does, we'll be quiet. Let it speak. He nodded, then added, I think the river just wanted to hear itself think. Somewhere a frog belched in agreement. So as you lie in your bed tonight, safe from floods and silence alike, remember this. Sometimes healing isn't action. It's permission. Permission to rest. To not flow. To not carry everything. Even the Nile, mighty and ancient, paused for a moment. And no one scolded it. For all her wisdom, all her care, all her precise measurements and calm words, there came a day, yes, even for Meritaten, when she forgot. Not something grand, not something tragic, just a simple stir. It was a quiet afternoon, the sort of lazy heat that makes you question why sandals exist. The geese were asleep, beaks tucked beneath their wings. Merira the cobra had shed her skin and was snoozing beside it, looking slightly proud of the accomplishment. Beck had gone to the market to barter for fig vinegar and possibly gossip. And Meritaten. She had a headache. Nothing alarming, just one of those soft, persistent hums behind the eyes, as if a minor god of misfiled scrolls was pacing her forehead. Still duty called. A traveler had arrived, sunburnt, weary eyes slightly unfocused from too many days under the desert sky. He sat with the heaviness of someone who wasn't sick, but was definitely not well. My bones echo, he said. I dream in reverse. Meritaten, who had heard stranger things, simply nodded. She began the ritual, boiled the water, measured the honey, dusted the mint, and reached for the tiniest pinch of powdered cobra venom from her carefully labeled jar. But then, she forgot to stir. She handed him the cup with a soft smile. He thanked her, drank deeply, and then nothing dramatic happened. No dizziness, no clarity, no visions of fish holding hands. Just a pause. He blinked. That tasted a bit sharp. Meritaten frowned, looked at the cup, looked at her fingers, and realized, oh, she whispered, I didn't stir. Now for anyone else, this might have gone unnoticed. But in her hands, ritual was more than routine. The clockwise motion, the rhythm, the moment they mattered. Not because the venom demanded it, but because the body did. The mind did. It was how the healing began. The man, sensing her unease, touched her arm. It's all right, he said kindly. Even the river forgets to flow sometimes. She gave him a second cup, this time properly prepared. Stirred slowly, clockwise, 3 full turns and a quiet breath between each. After sipping, he smiled. That's better. Feels like my ribs stopped arguing. When he left, she sat alone with the empty cup, feeling the quiet, not as peace, but as pause. And then she did something unexpected. She left the stall. No announcement, no sign. Just tucked the fang into its case, handed Merira a fresh linen pad, and walked down to the riverbank with nothing but her sandals and a flask of tea. There beneath a fig tree older than most families she sat, cross-legged, barefoot, quiet. Hours passed. Children played nearby and didn't bother her. A passing priest waved but didn't intrude. The breeze brought her the scent of papyrus and summer, and in that stillness, she finally exhaled. Beck found her there just before sunset. He didn't speak. Just sat beside her, held out a small basket with 2 fresh date cakes, and waited. She took one. They ate in silence. And then she said, "I forgot the stir." Beck looked at her. The one rule. He nodded. "Do you think the gods noticed?" He shrugged. "If they did, they probably said, 'She's tired. Let her be.'" She laughed soft and surprised. He added, "Besides, Marira didn't hiss. That's usually a sign." She sighed, leaning back against the tree trunk. "I've told everyone for years how important the stir is, that it's not just about venom and honey, but about the motion, the meaning." Beck turned to her eyes, calm. "It still is." But maybe, he said, plucking a blade of grass, even healers deserve to be a little unfinished sometimes. She didn't answer, but she let the wind ruffle her hair. That night, she returned to the stall, lit the lanterns, polished the cups, apologized to the fang not because it demanded reverence, but because it reminded her how fragile even the strongest habits can be. She added a new line to the recipe scroll: "If the healer is weary, let the tea wait." And from that day on, no one questioned if the remedy took a little longer. They waited, silently. Because healing wasn't just about what you drank. It was about being seen and being allowed to pause. So tonight, if you too have forgotten something, keys names which sock goes on, which foot take heart. Even the wisest healer once forgot to stir, and nothing fell apart. It was an early morning wrapped in gold. The kind of morning where the Nile looked like someone had poured melted sunlight into it. Where the geese for once weren't honking, but instead murmuring among themselves like old women discussing sandal prices. Where even the wind tiptoed. Beck awoke first. He always did now. Meritaten had quietly shifted more and more of the morning rituals to him over the past few months. First the sweeping, then the boiling of water, and now, most significantly, the stirring. He no longer questioned the clockwise motion. He didn't count his turns out loud. He didn't try to improve anything. He simply stirred. And the tea turned out just fine. This morning, however, felt different. There was something in the air, a stillness that wasn't heavy, a pause that didn't ask anything. And then she said it. "Today," Meritaten murmured from behind her herb jars, "you see your first patient. Alone." Beck blinked. "Just me? Just you?" She nodded gently, crushing basil leaves with the base of a spoon. "I'll be nearby, watching, possibly hiding behind the goose pen. But I won't interfere." Beck looked at the stool where patients usually sat. It suddenly seemed too large, too important, as though a small throne for a mystery he wasn't yet ready to meet. He took a deep breath and waited. The first patient arrived just after mid-morning. A young man, nervous, awkward, holding his elbow like it had said something rude. I feel warm," he said. "Not hot. Just like I've been near a lamp for too long." Beck nodded, very professionally. He motioned for him to sit. "Do you have headaches?" "No." "Strange dreams?" "Only once, involving a camel and a flute." "Unusual cravings?" "Is wanting to smell old books a craving?" Beck wrote that down, not because it helped, but because it sounded poetic. He prepared the remedy slowly. Water warm but not boiling. Honey just a finger's length. Mint. A pinch of dried fig bark. And yes, a dot, only a dot, of powdered Cobra Venom. Then he stirred, clockwise, 3 times. No more, no less. The young man watched with wide eyes as if expecting lightning or the appearance of a ghostly librarian. Beck handed him the cup. "Drink slowly." He did. Then paused. Then smiled. "I feel like my bones are stretching. In a good way." Beck nodded solemnly. "That's normal." It was not. But it was good. After the patient left, Meritaten appeared silently as usual, holding 2 cups of plain tea. "You didn't panic," she said. "I considered it," Beck replied. "You stirred carefully." I counted backwards. It helped. They sat together watching the birds steal crumbs from an unattended date basket. For a long while, neither said a word. Then she asked, "Did you believe in the remedy back when you first arrived?" Beck smiled. "I believed in the stories. And now I believe in the silence." Meritaten nodded, then said something she hadn't said in years. "You're ready." Beck blinked. For what? To begin. He almost dropped his cup. "I thought I already had." She smiled faintly. "No, you've been helping, learning, assisting. But now, you begin." That evening, he wrote in his journal, the one with ink stains and a page folded over from the day he tried to record a goose's sneeze. "Today I stirred for someone else. Today I didn't ask her to check. Today I trusted the silence more than the instructions." He paused, then added, "Also, I think the geese like me now." One of them blinked respectfully. The next morning, when he stepped out of the herb stall, someone was already waiting. They didn't ask for Meritaten. They asked for Beck, and he didn't call for her. He stirred, quietly, carefully, with hands that knew both fear and grace. Because one day, every apprentice becomes the one who stands at the front of the room. And when that day comes, it isn't loud. It's not a trumpet or a festival. It's a teacup, stirred just right. So tonight, if you feel unsure, small, or not quite ready, remember Beck. Remember the geese. Remember that sometimes you're more prepared than you think, and the world is just waiting for you to begin. Years passed. Seasons folded into each other like papyrus scrolls left gently in the sun. The herb stall remained, though the reeds that once shaded it had grown taller. The same woven awning fluttered softly in the breeze, patched here and there, with new fabric but still strong. The fang, now worn smooth from years of use and reverent fingers, rested in a polished wooden box, its edges wrapped in linen, not for fear, but for memory. Meritaten had grown quieter. Not weaker, not absent, just slower. She still brewed tea, still walked each morning to gather fresh leaves, still whispered to the jars of ingredients like old friends. But she let Beck see the patience now. She only stirred when the wind was too stubborn or the mint too shy. Beck, no longer quite an apprentice, wore robes that smelled of fennel and parchment. His hands moved without thinking. His voice had found a rhythm. He still joked with the geese, still recorded strange, patient dreams in his notebook, still tried now and then to improve the flavor of the venom tea, much to Meritaten's endless amusement. And then one day a child came. Not ill, not troubled, just curious. "Are you the lady with the snake medicine?" she asked, peering over the edge of the herb table. Meritaten chuckled. "I was, once. Can you show me?" She looked at Beck. He gave a small nod, then stepped aside. And so, for the first time in what felt like many lifetimes, Meritaten performed the ritual. Slowly, carefully. Water warm and patient. Honey thick with thyme. Mint dry but fragrant. And the tiniest dusting of powdered fang. She stirred, clockwise, 3 turns, a breath between each. The child watched in silence, eyes wide, as though the act itself was a kind of spell. When the tea was finished, the girl didn't drink. She just said, "That looked like a poem." Meritaten smiled. "It is." That night, as the stars blinked into their places and the frogs sang in well-practiced harmony, Beck found her sitting by the riverbank. She looked older, yes, but also lighter, like a weight had settled in exactly the right place. "I think," she said softly, "that I've stirred my last cup." Beck didn't protest, didn't plead. He just sat beside her. Together they watched the water shimmer. "Do you regret it?" he asked after a while. She shook her head. "No. The fang taught me to listen. The stirring taught me to wait. And the people, they taught me that healing isn't about fixing. It's about holding space, quietly." He smiled, then offered her a cup of tea made by his own hands, stirred just as she taught him. She sipped, closed her eyes. You finally stopped over minting it." He laughed. "Took me long enough." They sat until the moon slipped behind the date palms and the wind forgot to blow. In time, the villagers built a bench by the river in her honor. They called it the Place of Stirring. People came not to be healed, but to remember, to pause, to breathe. They didn't always drink the tea. Sometimes they just sat, and that somehow was enough. And as for the Cobra Venom, it faded from the brew, replaced by memory, by ritual, by the story. Because in the end, it wasn't the fang that healed. It was the care, the quiet, the moment. So now, dear dreamer, as you lie beneath your own stars and feel your breath slow, let the last drop settle. Let the cup be still. Let the story close, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Once in a quiet corner of Egypt, a woman stirred silence into medicine, and the world slept a little easier. Good night.